Brother Gideon will exhort us this morning to the theme of way of the blessed. And he's asked that we take a reading from Proverbs chapter 3. We'll ask our brother James Thompson to come and read that for us. Well, brothers and sisters, we look forward to our brother Gideon words this morning. The theme, the way of the blessed. Gideon.
Thank you, Brother Matt. And yes, thank you, Dad, for the correct pronunciation of the blessed. And that will be important. So, thank you for having me, my brothers and sisters. And I look forward to sharing with you that theme this morning. Because this is my first exhort at Hunter Valley, I kind of wanted to take this opportunity to say a very warm thank you. I thank God for you all, the Ecclesia, for the training you've given me so that I can actually stand here and encourage you today. And of course, bring to remembrance our Saviour, Jesus Christ. We moved here when I was 11, and I've spent, as in Hunter Valley, always lived in the area, but I've spent most Sundays since then being taught, not just by Sunday school teachers, but by every one of you, those older, as well as those younger, and my peers, of course. So not only your faith, but your works, and not only your spirit, but the truth you all hold dear. I thank you. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." I am that child. I'm one of the children that has learnt to walk by seeing those around him run. You've taught me the way. Now I walk with you all on that path as we walk with God towards life eternal. So once again, thank God for the Ecclesia. He's grown through all of you, and it's my prayer that Jesus will find us as followers who have not soiled our garments, and that he will say, as he said to the Ecclesia, Revelation 3, "They will walk with me in white, for they are worthy." With that said, I do want to draw our minds to some of those ideas I actually just alluded to when I thanked you. I thanked you for teaching me to walk. And I didn't just randomly think of that metaphor. It's actually an idea that permeates throughout Scripture. And I already mentioned two passages that speak direction, speak of aim and walking. I didn't thank you all in that way just so I could have a good opening, but I genuinely meant it. But it just so happens that some of the best language to describe what we strive to do as an ecclesia, or even as an individual believer, is to walk, to teach to walk, to not depart from the way we should go. So this morning we'll touch on those ideas. We're going to stick mostly within Proverbs to illustrate this image. Now, just a warning, it's going to get a little bit technical, maybe a little bit poetic. I understand that's not everyone's thing, but I promise it is only to serve the purpose of getting spiritual benefit and encouragement and, of course, remembrance this morning. So first, we'll outline some concepts that will help us understand the proverbial language, what the utility of the Proverbs is, and then we'll come to our focus, the way of the blessed, found in Proverbs 3. Now, Proverbs is actually boys' classes theme this year. And I think Rye is actually leading us on Tuesday, coincidentally, on Proverbs 3. So listening up, Rye, you might get some good points. And Proverbs 3 is also the day of the reading on Tuesday for those that follow the Robert. So, of course, like I said, these thoughts are to bring us to the life and sacrifice of Jesus, how he walked on that way before we take of the bread and wine. So I want to ask a question that anyone can answer. What are some poetic books in the Bible that we can think of? Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Cool. I would have been happy if you said literally any book of the Bible. Because why? Because all parts of the Bible are at some level poetic or symbolic. Everything is a type or an antitype. What I don't mean to say is that it's all non-literal. That would be a mistake, because there's obvious parts of our faith that necessitate a literal interpretation. But take the book of Numbers, for it isn't known for being beautifully written. That pencil. It isn't known for being beautifully written, and some people might even have a bit of an upper towards reading it. It can seem repetitive and difficult. Number 6:3 to 27, which also happens to be the reading on Tuesday, by the way, has a brilliant and symbolic tone to it. We'll know these words well. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you, peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. So that's obviously metaphorical. It's drawing on real events like Moses' face shining from seeing some of the glory of, but it's metaphorical. That's not to say the rest is boring, because it's not metaphorical. There's still a lot of depth in more literal language. I'm just highlighting the fact that in every book there will be these moments of quite obvious symbology. Now that's especially true of the writings, as we pointed out. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job. These are part of the section of the Hebrew Bible called the writings. We want to focus on these ideas of that come out of Proverbs specifically, and the image of the way. But let's just really quickly get familiar with some proverbial language. So come with me to Proverbs 1. Now, not being a Hebrew scholar yet, there will always be difficulty knowing exactly how the original Hebrew is formed. But I think our translations, for the most part, will preserve the times figurative language is being used. So in Proverbs 1, we see the very first, verse 9, first rhetorical device used. I'll read from verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. For they are, this is the metaphor, a graceful garland on your head, for your head, and pendants for your neck. So that might read a little differently in the KJV. I'm reading from the ESV today. But this is what we all know as a metaphor. Now, I know a lot of you already know what metaphors and symbols are, but I'm just going to cover the ground so we're all on the same page. The metaphor, it's when characteristic of A is applied to B, but B is described as if it's literally A. So an example of that is, he's a wolf, or you're a snake. It's different to a simile because you're not saying someone is like a wolf or as a snake. And so this is the metaphor here. They are a graceful garland for your head, and they are pendants for your neck. This verse will open up the floodgates for symbolic language in Proverbs. After this, it just doesn't stop. Solomon's prefaced the book. He's kind of said what it's meant to be about, and it's all out poetry time. I'm actually surprised it took him 8 verses. Now, there's a bunch of recurring themes that pop up over and over again in this book. Some of these are treasures and riches. We have that in chapter 2, treasure up my commandments, seek it like silver. You've got speech that can be either perverted or righteous. You've got a lying tongue, or the tongue of the righteous. Hearing, hear, O son, the father's instruction. And you've got father and son going through the entire thing. It's all about this relationship. And also mother and son. You've got laziness and prudence. And of course, keeping or guarding. And keep that one, pun not intended, in the back of your mind, because we will touch on that. But in Proverbs, this is probably one of the most famous themes that come up. There's this idea of a lady, and there's a couple different ladies. Come to verse 20 of Proverbs 1, and we're introduced to the first main lady. This is the wisdom. In the market, she raises her voice at the head of the noisy street. She cries out at the entrance of the city gate. She speaks. Okay, that's Lady Wisdom. Come over the page to Proverbs 2:16. That's where our antagonist appears. This is the forbidden woman. She's characterized as an adulteress here, and someone that has forgotten the covenant of her God. Now, both of these women's characters and what they do gets elaborated on throughout the Proverbs. But what's not given to them is a name. We're not told what their names are. We can guess at who they are. We can also guess at who they're inspired by. Almost definitely the adulteress of the many foreign women that Solomon loved. But what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't really matter who they are because they're symbols. These are just another symbolic or poetic device used by Solomon, and they characterize or personify wisdom and folly, righteousness and wicked, good and evil. Proverbs are poetic, but I just want to remind us of how subtly symbolic can be. What I mean by that is that we can take the Proverbs as a book of wisdom, which it is, but we can take it as something that only teaches us how to live our lives day to day. This isn't about earthly wisdom. Proverbs is not about earthly wisdom. From chapter 10 of the Proverbs, we actually have these parallelisms, which just means something is said. Well, I don't even know if it's called a parallelism, but it's something is said and then something else that's contrary. An example of that is the wage of the right leads to life, the gain of the wicked to sin. In 12 verse 1, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates proof is stupid. So, anyone that reads that will say that's wise. It's well known in the secular world, for example, that discipline is important and that a certain amount of reproof is necessary. But what we can't do is make the mistake of limiting the Proverbs to maxims for everyday life. The verses around Proverbs 12 verse 1 actually give us insight into what the verse is really about. Verse 2, for example, says, a good man obtains favor from Yahweh. Now, without even going any further, we've already realized that this isn't just earthly discipline. This is discipline that comes from God. And that comes out in other passages in Proverbs too. Let me give you one more demonstration of this. Come to Proverbs 6:32, please. This says, he who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. So I'm sure we all agree on that. I'm sure 9 out of 10 of the people on the street would agree with that. The ramifications of adultery are severe. But is that all it's talking about? Is it all practically? Well, let's have a look at the context. Verse 23 and on. The reproofs of discipline are the way of life to preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. So immediately we can see it's primarily actually talking about something that's contrasted to the commandment of God, which is the smooth tongue of the adulteress. This is the way of wickedness, lifestyle involved in not following this. So again, it's probably true that if you commit adultery, you lack sense, but it's not all it's saying. And once we compare other passages as well, for example, chapter 4, verse 5 to 6, it says, get wisdom, get insight. And then it says, do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. So the idea of wisdom again, and it brings you to thought how God used it as a treasured possession. And that comes out of 6:26, where it says the price of a prostitute is only a loaf of bread, but a married woman hunts down a precious life. Reminds us of the precious possession, but when they turn away from God, reminds us of the marriage bread. So it's a smart idea to not commit adultery, but it's telling of a deep scriptural relationship that he has with his people. We can actually see just from that. Don't need to turn there, but chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. It says what the book's about. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. It goes on in verse 7. It says, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. So this is a knowledge that's concerned about Yahweh. And that knowledge is like the knowledge that we see in the garden. in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's discernment between good and evil. That's the wisdom we're concerned about. And reference to the reading this morning, in Proverbs 3, verse 18, she is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Again, talking about wisdom. That's reference to Eden, which also had the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge, is the purpose statement of the book. And the fear of Yahweh is the quality that Eve lacked in transgression. She took hold of the fruit instead of taking hold of wisdom. As it says in Proverbs 16, verse 18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And finally, James 3:17 tells us exactly what this sort of wisdom is. Simply, it's wisdom from above. Let me conclude this point by saying a quote from Brother John Carter in his book on Jesus' parables that, by the way, are very similar to the Proverbs. He gives a preface on the title of the book. He says why it's called Parables of the Messiah. He suggests that the parables have a primary messianic meaning and says that to make them merely stories for moral truths robs them of their vital purpose. I believe that same idea can be applied to the Proverbs. Yes, they're wise on the surface level, and if one was to follow them, they would probably live a better life, but they're deeply found once you dig a little. In these verses, we also get an understanding that the Proverbs' main utility was for the youth in Proverbs 1, verse 4, and specifically to the sons of David and Solomon. It's the prince's manual. It's how to judge in righteousness, justice, and equity. It's how to rule. And there's royal language all through Proverbs, which we don't have time to touch on. So we've talked peripherally about the way. In fact, the subject has broadly come up in some of the verses. The reproofs of discipline are the way of life. The wage of the righteous leads to life. And train up a child in the way he must go. And again, this is subtle because we use this sort of language all the time. We say the way somebody does something is blah, blah, blah. But even in that, that's a metaphorical way of saying things. And I just used it then when I said way. It really does, at its basic form of the word, refer to a road that one goes down. And Hebrew and Greek are very metaphorical with their sort of language. Now that we understand the groundwork of the type of language, it'll help us understand the way of the blessed. So we're going to shed some light on that now. As discussed, Solomon uses explicitly poetic language. Keeping in mind that he uses poetic language, we also got to realize that he would have been drawing on other things that have happened, particularly other things that his audience would have experienced or known about. And I'm talking about Israel here. He would have been referring to Israel's history. And in particular, when we talk about the way and walking, he would have been referring to the many literal walks Israel as a nation had done. So to understand the idea of walking in Proverbs, we need to look at those who walked. And we'll get a picture of what walking is all about. The first acts of walking that come to my mind are the wilderness wanderings. Though it was long and arduous, though they traveled for 40 years on foot, when God was about to bring them, the next generation, into the promised land, Moses says, I've led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn off your feet. Throughout this trial in the wilderness, God was still guiding their steps. And as David writes, referring to his own trials, my steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. And he writes in the next psalm, you gave me a wide place for my steps under me. So God didn't let their shoes wear out for 40 years. And he didn't let them slip. Yet they complained insistently. They were a stumbling block to themselves. And I'm using that very intentionally there. Stumbling over. And too often they didn't heed the words of Joshua, which Solomon appropriates. Proverbs 4, do not swerve to the right or the left. Too often they would go after, which is also the word walk. They would walk after other gods and not walk after Yahweh, their God. Even further back in Israel's history, Abraham, he gets out, Genesis 12 verse 1, of Ur. He walks the length and the breadth of the land, for God's about to give it to him. Later in Genesis 15, Abraham cuts a covenant with God. Well, God cuts the covenant, Abraham cuts the covenant, and the smoking pot passes through it, referencing how one would walk or pass between the cut animals to make a covenant. So in chapter 17, as I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you. Here, walking before God has this idea of confirming the covenant. God requires an active participation in serving him, and this is what the idea of walking really entails. It requires us to take action too. It's manifested literally for Abram, leaving his home, walking the length of the land, witnessing the passing through of the furnace, and walking before God. Later, in Leviticus 26, verse 3, God would say to Israel, "If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, I will bless you." But in spite of this, he goes on to say, in verse 27 and 28, "If you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you." The idea of observing God's commandments is also picked up in Proverbs 3, which we will look at later. At the very start, it says, "My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments." Working even further back in Israel's history, you've got Noah, who walked with God, as well as Enoch, who walked with God, and right back to the beginning, the fork in the road, as it were, of good and evil, the way to the tree of life and the way of Cain. And after they transgress God's law, they walk contrary to God, God drives them out. And he sets cherubim to keep or guard the way. From here you have the enmity that it epitomizes everything in the Bible. Zion and Babylon, Lady Wisdom, Lady Folly, or the adulteress, and of course the way of the tree of life, the way of Cain. So some questions to keep in the back of our mind. Which way are we going? Which way is God going? Are we there with him? Are we holding him back? Are we tripping over? Do we look to the right or to the left? Do we search after other gods? Where is God leading us? So God's the first one to use that idea of walking, as we saw in Leviticus 26. And Proverbs now can make a lot more sense with those ideas of Israel's history in mind. Proverbs 2:20-22 says, "So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inherit the land, like the promised land, and those with integrity will remain in it, but the wicked will be cut off from the land." Same word as cutting the covenant that Abram cut. So, how do we know we're on the way? How do we know what it's like to be on that way? These are questions I hope to answer shortly. Now we come to our focus in Proverbs 3. The word for way is used around 70 times, for walk about 20, steps 3, path 5. And there's a bunch of other ideas like highways, streets. Did I mention feet? Feet is also in there. But in Proverbs 3, as we read this morning, there's plenty of this language. So verse 17, "Her ways are ways of pleasantness, all her paths are peace." We go over the page. Verse 23, "Then you will walk on your way securely, and your foot will not stumble." 26, "Keep your foot from being caught." And I think there's one more which I can't see. What I'm saying is, there's a lot of talk about way, paths, feet, not stumbling. Let's get into it. So the focus of this chapter is verses 13 to 18. Here we have a lot of themes tied together. Wisdom, again, is personified in verse 14. It's her. It's Lady Wisdom. Treasures and riches show up again, and they're used to describe how precious the woman is. And finally, the idea of ways ties it all together. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, all her paths are peace. That's verse 17. This here is the way of blessed. The word blessed blessed. The word bless, ed, bookends this passage. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. Now, this is the ESV, and I think KJV may have there. Let me digress briefly on the word blessed. Tend to look at this word, bless, blessing, and blessed, the same wherever we read it. And whenever the words are translated to English, there are connections between them, but we may not have multiple words for blessed from the Hebrew and Greek. For example, in Psalm 1, as we sang this morning, the word blessed is the word asher, which is the same as what Leah says when Zilpah has Asher or asher. She says, happy am I. That word is asher. So the word for blessed can be translated from asher, meaning happy or fortunate. However, that's not the same word as blessing, such as the blessing to Abraham. When God says, I will bless you and make your name great. This is the word barak and has an idea of kneeling or to cause to kneel. We can get a better idea of what that word means when we go to places like Psalm 145 that says, every day I will bless you and praise your name forever. Therefore, barak, blessing and praising, and particularly praising a name, as we saw Abraham's name made great, they're connected. And this makes a little more sense when you realize that the New Testament equivalent for this word is eulogio, where we get the word in English, eulogy, where we praise someone or speak well of them. So, the word in our proverb, in verse 13 and 18, is the first root word I was mentioning, asher, which is where we get Asher. It could then be translated, like it is in the KJV, happy is the one who finds wisdom. It's a good translation. In fact, most of the time, happy is a good translation for asher. Because the blessing can make us think of blessing to Abraham. Now, whilst I just severed those two words, barak and asher, this is the technical part I was talking about, just stay with me here. I actually want to suggest that there is a strong connection between these words. Whilst not the same words, they are connected. If you take blessed in verse 13 and blessed in verse 18, they're both asher, they're different conjugations of that Hebrew word, which simply just means the context and the characters are slightly different between them. Same word, same root word. The word in verse 13 is said, forgive my pronunciation, something like asher. The word in verse 18 is said ashar. Not too different, but the word ashar in verse 18 carries with it, this is the point, not only to be happy, but to go or walk straight. So to be blessed, asher, is to walk straightly, ashar. These words are so closely connected, and it's significant that Solomon uses them when he's talking about wisdom's ways are ways of pleasantness, and her paths are peace. And she's a tree of life to those who lay hold on her. The way to the tree of life is the way of the blessed. This is why we need to focus on the poetic language for a bit. But this is the way of the blessed. And the word ashar, which means walk straightly, but also translated as blessed, is used in Proverbs 4:14 as well. Don't enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk or go straightly, it's our word, in the way of evil. The way of the blessed, as I mentioned, is the way to the tree of life. It was the way Noah and Enoch walked. It was the way through the cut animals of the covenant by which God blessed Barak, Abram. To be blessed is to have atonement and eternal life with God. To have atonement, you must agree with God. Therefore, Amos 3:3 says, can two walk together except they be agreed? And to walk is to be blessed, asher. So these two ideas of blessed are really connected. Later in chapter 4, verse 18, it says, the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until the full day. We're reminded of God's light. how his face shines upon us. Number 6 again. And that was a blessing. Barak. Yahweh bless you and keep you. We're also reminded of how Jacob was blessed when he saw God face to face, before the sun rose upon him, lit up his face. Later in Proverbs 16:15, in the light of a king's face, there is life. So to be blessed, brothers and sisters, is to walk with God. It is to walk on the way and be in his presence. This morning, that's where we've come to. We have come to the way of wisdom, of which we have been taught. We have come to the way where God met Abram and blessed him. Please turn to Acts 3, verses 25 and 26. We'll tie all these ideas together now. It says, Acts 3, 25 and 26, "You are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, 'And in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed.' God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first," Peter talking here, "to bless you now by turning every one of you from your wickedness." We've been blessed with Abraham's blessing because we have had Jesus who blessed us. How? By turning away every one of you from his iniquities. Do you know what that word turning away is? In the Greek, it's apostropho, where we get apostrophe. It's that tiny little dash which turns around. So when we are turned away from our iniquity, we are following the words of Proverbs 4:27. "Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or the left. Turn your foot away from evil." That's apostropho in the Septuagint. God has blessed us in giving Jesus, who has blessed us in turning our foot away from the way of the wicked to the way of the blessed, to him who is the way. Quoting David concerning Christ, Peter in Acts 2 says, "You have made known to me the paths of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence." Again, that's the idea of God's presence and his face. We're blessed when we walk the path of life. We're blessed when we see God's face. Number 6, Jacob in Genesis 30. We come here today to the way because Christ says of himself, "I am the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father except through me." John the Baptist prepared the way for Christ. Christ walked the way he knew was narrow and straight, and God made him the way. God gave him the wisdom of Solomon, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Yahweh, which is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. So we are here this morning to remember that way. Now we must ask, so what? Why does it matter that Jesus is the way? I've talked quite figuratively. What should we do about it? Are we there with him? Well, it matters that Jesus is the way because after thousands of years, after countless times where God searched for someone that was worthy to become the way, but no man was able to do it, God brought forth his Son to show us the way back to the east, back to the garden, to the way of the tree of life. He took the tree, he carried it on the way, planted it in the ground, destroyed the enmity, destroyed the serpent, who invented the way of the wicked, the way of Cain. And Hebrews 10, verse 19 to 20 says, "Now we have boldness to enter the holiest by a new and living way that he has opened for us, tearing the veil that is his flesh." That's why it's important. That's why it's significant to us, because we now have boldness to go along that way, to walk that way into the holiest. So what must we do in response? Well, Brother John Thomas in Elpis Israel says, allegorically, the way of the tree of life signified the things to be believed and practiced by those who desired to live forever. He says, to believe and to do is to walk in the way which leads unto life. Therefore, because Christ walked, we must walk with him, in him. So we've got to be active in our faith. We must believe and do. We must practice our religion. We must move or we will die. We must not be a stumbling block to others. We must run the race with endurance. We must not look to the right or the left. We must put on for our feet the readiness of the gospel of peace. We must follow Christ's footsteps. We must walk in newness of life. And it truly is as simple as some of the final words of the preacher's other book, Ecclesiastes 12:13. Let us hear the conclusion of this whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. And what commandment is that? Love God, love your neighbor. On these two commands hangs the law and the prophets. That's what Jesus says. And that law which Christ is quoting from Deuteronomy 6, the laws where you're talking to your children, talk about them when you sit down, when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise. Solomon picks up on in Proverbs 6:22-23. Talking of the commandments, he says, when you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will talk with you. For the commandment is a lamp and the teaching a light, and the reproofs of discipline are the way of life. So Christ is the light. As we sang this morning, let us look to God through Christ and not walk in darkness. He is the way of life. Let us walk in him as we walk with God. And now as we look to the flesh and blood of Christ, let us remember the cry of the young women wisdom sends out to the simple in Proverbs 9:5-6. They say, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk way inside.